everyone. My name is Alana Mueller, and I'm Community Development Director for American Public Square. Tonight's program, The Good Fight for Resources, is the second in our series that we're presenting called the KC Common Good Initiative. KC Common Good, hosted by American Public Square, is an alliance that has emerged from a year-long effort to convene people and organizations that seek to reduce violence in Kansas City throughout the metropolitan area. We are also hoping to provide hope and access to opportunity for all members of our community. For more than 4 years, American Public Square has been bringing together people from throughout the metro to talk about controversial issues that are impacting us. KC Common Good is an extension of what we've been doing. This time, we're seeking solutions to a specific problem facing our community. On behalf of American Public Square, please join me in thanking our presenting sponsors, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, the Hall Family Foundation, Z-Trip, the Abernathy Charitable Trust, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, and H&R Block Foundation. Special appreciation also goes to tonight's sponsors, Peggy and Terry Dunn, the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, and the Dunn Family Foundation. Additionally, thanks to our program supporters, Faith Always Wins Foundation and Sandy and Ed Freed. I also want to thank our partners for tonight's program, National Archives of Kansas City and the Central Exchange. Join me in saying thank you. So as you may know, American Public Square is a member-supported organization. In fact, how many of you are members of American Public Square? Thank you, thank you. If you're not a member of American Public Square, and I won't ask you to raise your hands, you can certainly take a look in your playbill. It contains all the information you need to learn how to join American Public Square, and somebody will be available after the program if you'd like to learn more or to sign up tonight. And if you did not register for tonight's event, or you were registered as someone's guest, please feel free to register now at americanpublicsquare.org. By doing so, you'll be providing us with your name and email address. It will allow us to send you a survey for tonight's program, as well as information about future events. Also in your playbill, you'll find information about tonight's panelists, as well as some relevant facts about tonight's topic. There's also a link to more information that you might enjoy. We're able to provide this information due to a generous grant from the William T. Kemper Foundation. Additionally, in your playbill is a question and fact sheet. So on one side is a question space, on the other side a fact sheet. When you have a question or you'd like to have a fact check, please write it down on the sheet and hold it up so a volunteer can come by to collect it. There's no need to wait for a break. As soon as you have a question or a fact check, hold it up and we'll gather. We already have one. Well done, thank you. Checks in the mail. So those fact sheets and questions will actually be delivered to tonight's roving reporter, Classy Alcine. Classy, wave. Classy's up here in front. Classy will be asking your questions to the panelists. Additionally, I want you to say hello to Tom Burns and Chris LeBeau, who will be our fact checkers for the evening. We also have some civility bells peppered through the audience. If you have one, will you ring it now? It's a dainty bell. So if the tone of tonight's conversation, so panelists be forewarned, if the tone of tonight's conversation becomes less than civil, somebody will ring one of those bells and we will tone down the conversation, walk back whatever's said, and give people an opportunity to respond. We also ask that you not clap during the panel discussion. It not only saves time, but it also allows each panelist to talk, complete his or her thought without interruption, and it will maintain more of an atmosphere of civility. So with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Sara Martin. Sara is the Deputy Director of the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department, where she oversees initiatives to influence the social and economic policies that shape health inequities. Sara's education and experience are indicated in your playbill. However, I do want to mention that when Sara was a panelist at our program in May of 2017, she's told us that she thought her introduction made her sound like she never had any fun. So I want to give you a counter argument to that. This time, we want to make sure that you're aware that Sara is a big fan and a user of the new scooters that you'll see around town. I think that sounds pretty fun. So with that, please welcome Dr. Sara Martin.
Thank you. I'm actually like almost teared up that someone cared enough to go into my Twitter and find videos. But I live downtown, and so the scooters, I've become a big scooter nerd because it actually solves a lot of problems for me. So we are here to talk about problems. Thank you for being here. This is so much fun. I am very hungry. Like, I realized when I sat down, I was like, I am starving. So if you hear my stomach grumbling, I apologize ahead of time. We're going to keep it civil, but we're going to, I think, say some really important things today. And today, today is not just about violence prevention. We've talked a lot about that, and we've talked a lot about root causes, but today we're going to talk about what are some structural barriers to getting the work done. Especially because in a room like this, a lot of us may agree, like, here are some solutions, here are some determinants of this problem that we can address, but we're coming at it from a lot of different angles. So I come at it from a public sector perspective, but all of our panelists and all of you bring your own perspectives. And so we're going to figure this out in an hour and a half. We're going to figure this out. So I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists, some old friends, some new friends. So we have Dr. Nadabona Mabachi here from KU. You can read their bios and all of that. But I want to like point out that like the unique perspectives people are bringing to the table here. So Natty, so we're going by first names. I didn't know if you knew that that's like an American public square thing, but I've been reading a lot about how we call women by their first name and men Dr. something, but we're all going by first names today. So I will be Sara. Natty. Natty studies some really interesting work on like how the social environment leads to violence and leads to assault and all this like really powerful research that's very applied, but she has to work alongside people in different sectors to get this done. So she kind of brings that perspective. And then we have Dr. Brent, who I almost sent to the hospital once. I was just thinking about this. Brent and I used to work together at UMKC. We had a chili cook-off, and tomorrow there's a chili cook-off, so I have to jet the minute we're done to go make my chili. There was a chili cook-off. My secret ingredient happened to be something Brent is very deathly allergic to. I did not tell anyone my secret ingredient until his throat started closing up. And so you survived. We're reunited. It's very exciting. You may also recognize Brent from Lester Holt's show on NBC Nightly News, just talking about the truth divide, and his research is so important because it studies how are like some organizations sick and healthy, right? So we kind of treat organizations like people in solving society's biggest problems. We're very lucky to have two very esteemed researchers. Speaking of esteemed, this is very exciting. To be able to sit down with you on a stage, Mr. George, and talk about social problems was really cool. So I'm really, really happy that Bill George is here because this brings a very unique perspective, I think, of someone in the private sector who's looking at social problems and thinking, what is my place in all this, as both a private philanthropist, but also kind of like a gadfly, right? Like how does our private sector put some pressure on the public sector and on the nonprofit sector to affect change? So we're really, really grateful that you're here. And then Jim Mcdonald, the man with the money. That's what I like to call you. So Jim Mcdonald from United Way, what does it mean when you have this portfolio? You manage a portfolio of something like $15 million of money for the greater Kansas City area. So we're going to talk a lot about like what are the hallmarks of really strong organizations that we would want to give all our money and time to. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So raise your hand if you currently work for a nonprofit organization. Ooh, okay. If you've ever worked for a nonprofit organization, raise your hand. If you left a nonprofit for a different sector, raise your hand. Okay, that's interesting. This is a really great mix. So that leads to our first question. And this one is going to be for each one of you. So we'll start down here at the end, and we'll work our way through. Why are nonprofits even necessary? And as maybe a follow-up, what is their unique contribution to solving these big social problems? We don't have to go in order. You can also go popcorn style if someone had something they really wanted to say, but I want to give you all an opportunity to kind of start with that question.
I can start.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking earlier, and we were, historically, traditionally, not-for-profits have existed because they've filled a gap. They filled a gap that government couldn't fill, so be it access to food, access to healthcare. That's why not-for-profits exist. And I think that sometimes that has caused some contention, especially among, if we're talking about not-for-profits collaborating with government organizations. But I think in the work that I have done, to contextualize it a bit, so I work with the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault, MOCSA, which is a not-for-profit. And we are looking at sexual assault prevention, but at a community level. Traditionally, we've looked at this issue from an individual and a relational level, but the CDC has challenged us to look at it from a community level. And I have watched, I work for the state because I work for KU, so we have a partnership together that has been really fruitful, but I've watched MOCSA create relationships with government organizations, and these have sometimes been fraught, but MOCSA has been able to bring something to the table that I think government agencies sometimes can't. So for example, MOCSA has partnerships, stakeholders, has in with communities that sometimes government doesn't, is able to leverage their relationships with communities to bring certain voices to the table that maybe sometimes government can't, especially when we're talking about violence prevention. Oftentimes our governments look at it from a criminal justice system. MOCSA is looking at it from a public health prevention standpoint, and that means that they have very different relationships with community than our local government. The other thing that they can bring to the table is the kinds of funding that they receive. So MOCSA obviously raises a lot of their funds from fundraising, but for all our public health work, we are getting our money from the federal government, so the CDC. We're looking at funding from the NIH. And sometimes this is funding that governments may not necessarily have. And so we're maybe a bit more flexible in how we use that funding to address the issue of violence prevention. I think governments are much more rigid in what they can do with their monies. They have their strategies that they have at the beginning of the fiscal year. And so I think we have much more flexibility in regards to that. I also think that not-for-profits bring a perspective that government, be it local or state, doesn't necessarily have. Again, I mentioned this whole public health perspective. It's been really interesting trying to bring along our criminal justice folks who are at the table to look at violence prevention from a public health standpoint. It's been challenging, but I think it's been really rewarding in terms of the work that we're trying to do. So not-for-profits exist because, frankly, there are gaps. Frankly, there are holes that they have filled. We have seen them filling it in this country. I work in East Africa, and not-for-profits, as you guys know, in developing countries is huge, fill huge gaps there. But I think that there's potential for some really good strategic partnerships if we recognize what each other's agendas are and are able to create reciprocal relationships. So we can fulfill our agendas, but at the same time keep the reason why we're there at the center of the work that we're doing.
Great.
So first off, thank you for being here. I see some former students. I teach about nonprofits, so I could go, talk for 16 weeks about this, and I agree with a lot of what Natty says. I would say this, all right? If you think about societal problems, violence being one of them, public health being another, they're large, multifaceted, complex, and if you look at how we think about the world and addressing public problems, traditionally we've thought of two ways. We've thought about government and then we've thought about the market. So those are two ways of thinking about it. The market does great things. If I want a hamburger, McDonald's will serve me a hamburger. If I want a Volkswagen or a car, I'll go buy a Volkswagen. If I don't have money, I can't get a Volkswagen. The other solution has been state, government, right? So we can think of the government pooling together all of our resources, some coercion involved, right? You know, not everybody wants to pay taxes. And then we can provide people with hamburgers or cars or education more appropriately. I will say, to put it in context, to think about the fact that our government is shrinking and we just have to get over it. You know, this is a trend around the world. The welfare state is not what it was for our parents or grandparents. So we have to be okay with the idea of figuring out how to solve our problems, harnessing the market and the state. And that's where I would say nonprofits come in. So nonprofits are in this sweet spot of being able to speak across those two structures that traditionally we've thought about in thinking about solving our problems. And also, I'll just say, I am a small government progressive. Go figure. What that means is I think that nonprofits and community organizations writ large address people's problems better than the government or the market. Meaning, if I know my organization in my neighborhood, I'm much more likely to want to interact with them than the DMV or McDonald's. So I think the nonprofit sector is tremendously important in our lives, and something that you know, we've embraced in Kansas City and is truly a jewel of what we are in our community.
So are you advocating, if I'm hearing this right, for government-sponsored hamburgers? Is that what we're, because what I wrote is a hamburger for every household.
That's
So-
right.
Okay.
That's right. I'm
That's
hungry
the
also.
motto that has come out of, yes. Mr. George.
I think Shake Shack's going to have a great night
Shake-
tonight. You know, you'll hear me talk a lot tonight about passion, and what I love about nonprofits are that most of them started from a passionate individual or a passionate group of people that identified a need that wasn't being met, and they built an organization around it. And what I love about that, and as a entrepreneur in a business that is highly regulated, I don't believe most governments do things efficiently. Then the bigger the programs get, the less efficient they are at handling them. So getting this group together that is very passionate about solving a problem, that's not subject to term limits or the party in power or what the whim of the week is in politics, but be really able to focus on their mission and really have to be redeemed each month, week, year with finances by delivering on that goal. I think it's probably the most basic form of an entrepreneurial organization, and one that really, when you go to solve problems, if you can incubate them there and then grow and keep true to your mission, I think it is the most efficient way to address an issue.
Last
So
but not
the
least.
disadvantage of sitting on the end is that all of the ideas
I'll
you've
start with you next.
contemplated
Yes.
get said, more eloquently, but get said before you get a chance to. I'll just add to the conversation and it's hard to not be in an audience, with an audience like this, it's hard to not feel like you're stating the obvious. So like I don't consider myself any more of an authority on these issues probably than anybody in this room. But you know, just to state the obvious that nonprofits get to do good unencumbered by the need to pay taxes with the revenues that they raise to do that good. And so, you know, the foresight of, I'm not sure if it goes as far back as our founding fathers, but, you know, whatever administration decided to create tax-exempt status for a nonprofit organization, you know, that decision has obviously a lasting impact over the generations. And, you know, it's not the only way that the nonprofit sector is different from the for-profit sector or from, or maybe in some ways from government. I would just echo the sentiment that the nonprofit sector is a place where innovation is maybe more apt to happen because it doesn't have the same restrictions. Many nonprofits, you know, started as just the good idea of an individual at their dining room table. who gathered a few of their friends to hear their idea and then built, a movement. I've been around long enough at United Way over my 30-year career to see a lot of the larger nonprofit institutions that emerged as small fledgling efforts of a group of volunteers, whether it's to fight HIV and AIDS, domestic violence, human trafficking, and the nonprofit sector is, perhaps the most important partner that the government sector has. The government doesn't just outsource to defense contractors, they outsource to health and human service providers. I glanced at the kind of aggregate budgets of our United Way's grantees before coming over, and with about a $400 million collective set of budgets, about half of that money, a little over half of that money comes from government contracts and grants. 55 million from foundations, 125 million from individuals. And so, the importance of the nonprofit sector as, one of the government's most important partners, can't be understated.
So starting with you this time, and we don't have to go through it, don't feel that every person has to respond. I wish every time I'm on a panel, I wish someone would just lay out that ground rule. You don't have to respond if you don't want to. But I am going to ask you directly, Jim. What are some of the defining characteristics of when you see like, wow, that not-for-profit's going somewhere? Like if it's a fledgling thing and there's passion and there's credibility and there's a clear plan, what are some like trademarks of really successful nonprofit organizations that you have either funded or worked with?
I think probably chief among them is a clear, compelling mission. It needs to be, what the good work that the organization is doing needs to be readily understandable. And the extent to which the leaders of the organization are building a set of stakeholders, constituencies, both in terms of the people they're trying to serve as well as the other people they've convinced that this is a good cause and who are willing to give their time or money to get on board. One of the bits of advice that I give to prospective grant seekers, and oftentimes those phone calls come from folks who haven't gotten their 501c3 status. They're that early in the development of the organization. One of the first things I kind of inquire about and encourage them to do is just get other people on board, whether it's as a volunteer or as a contributor. I'm not one of those people that feels that all the nonprofits who do a particular thing need to merge. I think there's like almost a fixation among some funders or other civic leaders around that notion. I think competition in the nonprofit sector is essential, and that manifests early on, especially in terms of who can you convince that your idea is a good one, and how many people can you get to write a check to your cause at the individual level.
Anyone else?
I think, really compelling nonprofit organizations are those that have the compelling mission, but also have the wherewithal to stay in business. I'm a nonprofit pathologist. I study sick nonprofits. In fact, in really what I find is, there's a lot of compelling missions out there, but unfortunately you have to keep the lights on too. And so we have to figure out as nonprofit executives, managers, how to balance both of those. And in studying these sick nonprofits, I have the data here. You can fact check it actually, but which is really nerve-wracking. But what we find is that the sickest nonprofits are in communities of diversity. They're in communities of lowest socioeconomic status. They're in communities that are serving the people most in need, and those are the sickest financially nonprofits. And we have to figure this out, because if the most need, if we use the market analogy a lot, so if people need something, we'll provide it. Well, that works for, again, hamburgers. If you have a need for a hamburger and you have a $1.50, you can get one. If you have need for daycare and you don't have money to pay for daycare, what's the incentive for that organization to move to where your need is? And that is the nub of the real problem here. But you have to have both, again, the compelling mission and then the business wherewithal to keep the lights on.
Bill, what are some, I mean, as you listen to this and you're thinking about, what are some things that make you want to get involved with an organization? As someone with business wherewithal, right? What are you looking for in those partners?
I think the number one thing is, where can I make a difference? Where does my donation actually make a difference in a cause that I'm passionate about? And then I look at, secondly, how can that be leveraged? And does it just fall into a black hole, or can it really turn into something? And then the third thing is it truly making a difference? I mean, is it worthy to continue giving to it and making sure that they're moving the needle on whatever their mission is? And that's both in giving in monetary resources as well as time and expertise and volunteer resources as well. Just where can you get the most impact to create a benefit?
Why are people, this is a selfish question. I can do that because I'm the moderator. And then we're going to go to the roving reporter, because I noticed there were some cards pouring in. Okay. Why do people brag about donating to United Way, for instance, right? So we have this like charity campaign happening in the city, and everyone's really, really excited about it. And we do bake sales, chili cook-offs. I was in a dunk tank, right? So we're really excited, and we raise money for things for Moxa, for our birthdays on Facebook, but we hate paying taxes, right? So we don't think of taxes as like a donation to government services. What is the nonprofit community doing right in getting people excited about sacrificing financially for the greater good that government is not doing? How can I get people excited about paying my salary with their property taxes?
That's right.
I take that one a little bit.
Yeah.
It's once again, it goes back to the leverage. And you look at, in Kansas City alone, how many different sales taxes we have. And it's interesting because it was, when I was on the Visit Kansas City board and was the chairman, we started looking at what the hotel tax was. And even though Kansas City had very low hotel rates compared to our peer set, when you added in our tax rates, when you started putting arena taxes in and CT taxes and this tax and that tax, all of a sudden your $100 hotel bill became $122 when all was said and done. And what I noticed was all the properties now, you see the breakdown on the taxes. So you'll see arena tax, you'll see this tax or that tax. So when it goes directly to something that people can really see and say, I am supporting this effort, it's like you look at the zoo tax, you look at other ones that have passed resoundingly. When people know where their money's going and they get a tangible result, they're usually positive about it. When it goes into the black hole of taxes, and then you watch an agency that you support continually lose their funding because of budget cutbacks, that's where I think a lot of the angst comes in. And there's a bitterness about paying taxes and a separate way to say, how can I support the organization that means something to me?
To jump in on that, I agree completely with how you assess the situation. And one of the frustrations, I guess, that I personally feel with that, and I'm sure you do too, is that government has to address all problems. We have the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause. We have the idea that whether you're an ex-offender or not, you have due process to whatever service. And one of the frustrations with the nonprofit sector is really the causes that have the cute, cuddly animals. So I was on the mayor's revenue commission, and we had talked through kind of these little tax votes we have. So we have the zoo tax, we have the library tax, we have this tax and other tax. And when you put a nice shining kid's face on the tax or a nice penguin on the tax, everybody's for it. But unfortunately, problems aren't cute and cuddly, right? So, there's room for everything. That's all I'm trying to say. And there's ample room for state services and ample room for nonprofits too.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, Bill, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it goes back to the emotional connection that donors create with the charity they're supporting that just frankly isn't there when it comes to government. I mean, it is for some of us. You know, I mean, I love paying my taxes. That's why I talked to my daughter about it, who's only 7 years old. And I have had the benefit as a volunteer at City Hall and as a grantee from some federal and state grants to get a glimpse into how incredible a job our elected officials and government bureaucrats, who are frequently experts in their fields, are good stewards of our tax dollars. I'm not crazy about how all of our tax dollars are spent. I wish less of it was spent to service debt, for example. But I think the government has a job to do in terms of making those helping foster those emotional connections. And anytime there's an issue-specific tax-related ballot measure that we're voting on in Kansas City in particular, they tend to pass. The more specific, the more likely it is to pass, it seems to me.
Interesting. Nadi, to follow up on that, because your background's in health communications, health marketing, and I just think that's such a fascinating field, because how do you, especially when we're looking at sexual assault survivors, domestic violence, how do you make those emotional connections? They're not cute penguins, right? These are like very scary issues and very traumatizing issues for people without exploiting the people that we're serving. How do you make those emotional connections? Or where do you see organizations doing it quite well?
I think it's a balance. I think that's a really hard, it's a hard communication strategy to develop. And I think that organizations like MOXA do it really well in terms of appealing to people's sense of social justice. I think that's one of the biggest things that they're really able to do, that if you are a human being who cares about people's rights, women's rights, about trafficking, about child abuse, all of those things, then this is a cause that you should be interested in and concerned about. I think that we should never underestimate the psychological satisfaction that comes from donating to a cause that you feel a connection with. Also, it's an empowering thing for you to be able to donate to something that you feel helpless about. Whenever we talk about sexual assault in the community, the reaction we get is, don't even know where to start with that, can't even deal with it, how can we even address gender issues in this country? People are just feel like it's such a huge issue that they don't know where to approach it. So when you give them these small strategies and say, hey, you can donate so that we can do Green Dot. Green Dot is a bystander awareness program that MOXA does in Missouri. That's an empowering thing to be able to contribute to that. And so I think that appealing to those kinds of issues, the helplessness issue, the social justice issue, using social marketing techniques, the techniques that we use to sell hamburgers, you know, actually works in the healthcare field really well.
Yes.
Appealing to those cognitive thinking, processes for human beings, I think, is what we try and do. Not that it's easy, but yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're ready for some, I can tell the tension is killing me, ready for some audience questions. So we have one lined up.
Yes. As mentioned through the fact sheet, it talked about $400 billion is donated by folks every year. And the question was, do you think a lot or some of the name brand nonprofits have gotten too big?
Name brand. I like that. Are we too big to fail, Brent?
That's such a good question. Whoever asked that.
The NFL is a nonprofit. Is this true?
Because I was actually talking about this with a colleague who studies hospitals, right? So I'm fascinated by hospitals because we have nonprofit and for-profit hospitals here in Kansas City and across the country. And do you think a St. Luke's acts differently than an HCA? I mean, really? Have you been to either of those institutions? And so the question is our cute, cuddly, charitable nonprofit hospital quite so cute, cuddly, and nonprofit? You know, he studies surprise medical bills, which is really interesting, and he shows that, you know, these nonprofit hospitals are just as nasty sending people to collection as for-profit hospitals. So I just think it's a fundamental question, because we do think of these charities as these warm, fuzzy creatures, but you know, there's some antitrust issues with nonprofits. There's really, we need to grapple with that.
I'd encourage everybody to look at the fundraising expense ratio, and that answers a lot of that question. And when you look at especially some organizations that compete in the same space, and you look at the dollars that go to fundraising activities and how many dollars actually end up in the programming, there's in some organizations, it's astounding how much it is, and I think that's a good guide. And you know, along that with GuideStar, and one of the projects that we're working on that got me involved with this Choose Your Passion KC that we're working on, one of the things we're doing is the agencies that are going to receive support from it, we're linking their 990s, their returns, and their GuideStar information, so people can truly see when they're giving to an agency how much of that is actually going to deliver the service.
Interesting.
Sarah, as an employee of a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit, you add us all together, feel a little compelled to respond. Maybe with just a little bit of a defense of one of the, I can't speak to the other big ones, but from the perspective of United Way, at our core, we're in our 100th anniversary year here in Kansas City, and so we just had our centennial celebration last week. And we've been doing a lot of soul searching because we're still operating on a 100-year-old business model, and we're being compelled to rethink how we do our fundraising and our engaging in the community. But at the end of the day, United Way, after 100 years, continues, in my view, to remain one of the most sort of egalitarian forms of philanthropy. At the end of the day, it's about an army of volunteers going out, and we don't knock on doors anymore, but we knock on cubicle walls, coworkers asking coworkers to contribute. At United Way, we give donors the opportunity to earmark their gift or part of their gift and then put some of it in the community fund. About a quarter of our donors do that. And we're proud of the fact that we support nonprofit organizations, large and small. And if I were, if I were forced to choose between the big ones and the little ones, between the newer, more grassroots ones and the ones that are part of the mainstream establishment of philanthropy in America, I wouldn't be able to make that choice, because I see good and I see efficiency and I see innovation happening across the board. It doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens at all levels. And when you look at metrics like budget size or number of employees or that kind of thing.
Do we want to do another one? I love audience questions. Okay.
They're really great questions. Is there research on nonprofit collaboration? Is it good for communities, for fundraisers? Is collaboration the goal of nonprofits?
Everyone's like,
So,
yeah.
I don't want to be the one talking.
They said
Although,
research,
ironically,
so,
I'm the one
yeah.
up front, I guess. So,
You study this stuff.
Yeah, that's
What-
what I'm looking at you.
What's the answer?
here's a little experiment we did. We have an experimental lab at the Block School, and what we did is we had a group of nonprofit CEOs, executive directors, and a group of for-profit CEOs, and a group of students. And we put them through these collaborative games, right? It was basically you have a bunch of poker chips, and you have to decide whether you're going to put it into a common pool or you're going to keep it in your pocket at different rates of returns depending on what you did. And you basically create this game such that you try to get each other to screw each other, right? That's the way the economics works. And our assumption was that nonprofits would over-cooperate. They'd put more money into the middle common pool and less in their own pockets. And then the for-profit executives would, be those for-profit executives and put it all in their wallets. Little did we know that putting it through the whole protocol, for-profits over cooperate, nonprofits under cooperate. Wow. So we're writing it up. Don't write it up yourself. It's being written up right now. And our idea, trying to explain this is that in the nonprofit funding world, it's so zero-sum. Either I get the grant or you get the grant. There's not two grants. Versus in the for-profit world, there's a lot of room for maneuver. There's a lot of capital out there. Not that it's easy, it's just not as zero-sum. So there is some research, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
And I think it's to tag onto that a little bit, and what has been eye-opening for me in the past 6-7 months while I've been involved in this is to learn it is like the Hunger Games when it comes out there. And so we've set up an environment where we all agree intellectually that nonprofits should be collaborating to further their collective missions, but we set it up that could be almost the kiss of death because it's weakness and somebody else gets your funding. And so a lot of them keep their heads down, and then my experience has been the ones that actually deliver the highest level of services are so focused on that mission that they're terrible fundraisers. And it becomes an afterthought and in a way to keep the lights on. And so bringing some balance to that, if you don't have anybody on staff that knows how to write a grant, pretty much don't get grants because you can't speak the foundation speak. And so as a result, you can't grow your mission even though it should be something that increases and your reach broadens. And hopefully we can create an environment that collectively, if all these pieces come together, and you get to the whole thing that brought us here with KC Common Good is how do you reduce violence? And I think everybody agrees there's no switch. There's no magic wand that could be waved because if there was, it would have been done. But it's 1,000 different things to have to go in that we won't see an immediate reduction in some areas, but it's a cultural shift that has to happen. And no organization, one single organization is capable of doing that. So the idea is, can we go ahead and shift people's minds that, number one, they understand this is a city-wide issue. For people to say that doesn't happen in my neighborhood, therefore it's not my concern, it impacts everybody in this community, whether it's in your pocketbook or somewhere, everybody is getting impacted. And to be able to say that we've got to collectively bring forces together, focus on an area to say we can make a difference here, and hopefully by proving that, getting cooperation, getting people to work together, and getting measurable results. And at the same time, getting community backing, people that haven't given, and young people that really would like to give but don't know how to. We talked about the scooters. When everybody sees their credit card bills come in, and all of a sudden Bird's on there 97 times for unlocking a scooter for $1.15 a minute, to appeal to them and say, you know what, if you gave $10 a month to an organization you're passionate about, you realize you can make a difference. And it brings in this whole new level of philanthropy that if we reach them when they're young, we can hopefully get them in the spirit of doing that, get them volunteered, get them engaged, and hopefully we create something here that doesn't exist right now, which is this focused effort.
Yes, please. And then I'm going to jump on youth engagement in a second. But yes, go for it.
So just to piggyback off what you said, addressing violence is going to be everybody at the table working together. And I think that it's a misconception that we necessarily have to compete. It's either you get the funding or I get the funding. I think we can collaborate and go for the funding together. And if you look at some of the agencies that are funding this work, they actually insist on these collaborations. They insist on multi-organizational, multidisciplinary teams together because they recognize that the only way we're going to address such an issue like violence is if we all come to the table and if we collectively apply for these big monies together. I've seen that's happening in Wyandotte County in Kansas City, Kansas. I've seen that with the work that I've done in Africa. Global Health Innovations is the organization that I work with. We work in HIV and cervical cancer. And the only way that we have expanded from 2 hospitals in Kenya to 30 hospitals, from 2 hospitals in Tanzania to 70 hospitals, from 1 hospital in Malawi to 80 hospitals in Malawi is because we collaborated with other not-for-profit, governmental, academic institutions to go for those monies, and we stopped coming from a place of lack to a place of how do we do this together? I hate to say this word, for the greater good. Yeah.
So this is a question that has really plagued me as I've been thinking about this panel. It's kind of building off the birds or limes, whatever your scooter preference is. Let's talk about workforce, and let's talk about how we attract innovators, people with business acumen, people who are really passionate but also very good at thinking about things that are maybe not sexy, like revenue projections or workforce development or all these functional foundational things. It's not just going to be you and me and my friend in our garage saving the world. At some point we need to scale up, and that takes some talented workforce. However, salaries being as they are, we can collaborate for one grant, but there's now 6 of us instead of 3 of us, and now we're all going to get paid half as much as we would have otherwise. And those are some realities, right? So what do we do as a system? Not just a nonprofit, it's not just on that sector to make this work. What do we do? How do we get the right people working in our organizations to build them into what they could be?
First stab at this one. Part of what this Choose Your Passion organization that we're starting was designed to fill that we look at how do we affect the whole life cycle, from prenatal care to early childhood to what do kids do after school and daycare, and how we get people access to all the things in the community, all the way to senior services, and to hopefully sponsor organizations that hit everywhere along that the continuum. And then have people have options. So what Choose Your Passion is designed to do is to not raise a dime for itself, but to, in essence, put the organizations out there so people that are passionate about a certain thing, whether it is domestic violence or senior care, whatever you want to do, that you have an organization that has been vetted through here and that is targeting results and has agreed to say we will be measured by these results so people can see what their score is. And our goal is to go to the workforce and say, if a company and their employees want to be passionate about a certain item, pick it like you would a menu, agree to give up to $10 per month and have your employer match it. And what we think that will do is create a new source of funding that doesn't exist today, not in competition with anybody, but to enhance the organizations that already exist. So don't start anything from scratch. Just really get the support that's needed. If 1% of the employees in Kansas City would do $10 per month, it was matched, it's over $2.5 million a year in new funding that would come out. And if we target that into one of our most violent sectors and are able to deliver improved results, decrease violence, a sense of hope, a sense of empathy, and more importantly, the whole community understanding what it takes to solve this problem, we think that's a good start that could be built upon. So it acts almost as that fundraising apparatus for a not-for-profit so they can continue to deliver on their mission and not be distracted by this. And then hopefully as they grow, do they graduate to United Way or to other agencies where they can continue their mission? And if we seed this properly, just like you would in a landscape project, you put the proper ones there and hope it grows together.
Right. So that seems to be a dual purpose. And one, it's alleviating some of the pressure of these kind of fledgling nonprofits who are trying to grow and say, hey, you have this source of income, focus on your workforce development, focus on your business plan. But it also puts everyone's performance metrics out there for all to see in a way that's easily consumable so people, us, the givers, right, the funders, can pick and choose where we want to put our money. So I can see that definitely contributing to some sort of workforce health. I tend to see in the violence prevention world, especially small nonprofits, we're very uncomfortable talking about competition or how we make money or diversifying our budgets. And these kind of they see that as kind of, oh, those are private sector words. we're here to do good work and social justice and lots of passion, but not a lot of like accountants, right? And so how do you get the accountants in there as well? For those of you who've also like worked with these nonprofits who might have failed or might have succeeded, what did their staffs look like? How did they pay them? And why do people have to be poor in order to work in a nonprofit?
Yeah, so so I'm at a school, exactly, right, a vow of poverty. I'm at a school of business, which is pretty unique for a public administration program. And I see a lot of MBA students, a lot of business students coming into my courses. I teach nonprofit courses. And it really is the folks who don't want to necessarily take a vow of poverty. Heck, they have Sally Mae on their backs to pay their student loans. But they also don't want to give up on the idea that community really matters to them. And that's really heartening to me. In this political environment, whatever your persuasion right now, it's pretty disheartening. So to see a 23-year-old and a 24-year-old come up and say, you know what, this really matters. And I may go work for Cerner, but gosh darn it, either I'm going to make Cerner care about communities, which it does in many facets, or I'm going to also start my own nonprofit or social venture or whatever. So you see this really cool mixture of people who, this is not, on one hand, social workers who do wonderful work, and business people on the other. It's not this duality in the world. We're finding a lot of people who are wanting to play in that middle space that's really great right now.
What about the proposition that we hear sometimes from not-for-profits working in the violence prevention world that like unless you're from this neighborhood, you cannot work for this neighborhood?
Ran into that last week. You know, look, as I say, it is a community problem. And to put it, you know, one of the things that came up in our discussions, you put it bluntly, we focus on the murder rate. And the reality is, when somebody is murdered at a scene, to put it in cold, hard dollars, it's usually the ambulance bill to take them to the morgue. When they get shot, that's where there's $100,000 to $200,000 to $300,000 in uncompensated medical care. That filters through the system in higher insurance premiums and less services for prenatal mothers and other services. So part of this is getting, I think that all of us have to understand we all play a part in this, and it is our collective problem. And I think when you, first of all, come to that understanding, and there's cultural issues that in my background, I'll never get. I'll never understand, and I don't purport to, but it's a matter of going to the neighborhoods and saying, number one, we're here to help, but more importantly, we're here to listen. And tell us how we can help. And I start with the premise that no parent ever wants to bury their child. Right? And no matter where you travel in the country and the world, people love their children. And so when you start with that, we all have that immediate common bond. And you try and build on that. And it's a level of trust. We can't be the flavor of the month. We have to go through the hard times, and I think we have to be involved with people in the community and let them know we're committed to seeing it through and being a partner.
I also think that communities recognize that they do need outsiders. Communities recognize that sometimes they don't necessarily have the expertise to address a certain issue. They may understand the issue because it's affecting them directly, you know, but they may not necessarily have the tools, and it not necessarily just in regards to money, but like for me, may not necessarily have the public health research tools to be able to address the issue. I'll never forget the first time I started working in Kansas City. I was working in it's a low-income, high-minority community, and one of the community members from the local not-for-profit organization said, if you want to help my community, move here. I don't want any weekend warriors, okay? obviously, I wasn't going to move there. I already had where I was living, etc. But as our relationship grew and as our trust built, she recognized, she was calling us in and asking for our expertise because we knew something.
Right.
But at the same time, we were ensuring that her voice and the community voice remained the primary one. I have to say this, that as an academic, it is very easy for my agenda to overtake whatever it is I'm doing in a community. And I have to always remember that that's the voice that has to be remain primary throughout everything we do, every single thread of the work that we do in that community. So I think communities recognize that they need outsiders, so to speak. But as outsiders, we need to be very careful and very thoughtful about how we're working in communities and empowering community members.
Do we have another question from the audience?
So we have a couple of fact checks
Oh.
that Tom and Chris will talk about.
Okay, sometimes fact checks aren't so quick. One person, let me go to this one first. One person asked, is government really shrinking? And looking at some data from the
What
Washington.
shrinking?
What?
What's
Shrinking. Is government
Is
shrinking?
government shrinking for real? Yes.
For real. The Washington Post did analysis, and they found the government shed 16,000 jobs between January and September of 2017. And this is in stark contrast to the first 9 months of the Obama administration, when the federal workforce grew by 68,000. Let's see, who's going up and down? Let's see, Department of State is down, education is down, labor is down, housing and urban development is down, Homeland Security is up, and Veterans Affairs. And then, of course, locally, the person was interested in federally and state and local. For Kansas, I think we all know the situation over there. Workforce review that the number of non-university state employees shrank 25% between 2002 and 2016. There's more data here if you'd like to check with me afterwards. In Missouri, I think we're familiar with the Greitens slashing of the budget. Before he left office, his budget cut $98 million. He also had another $159 million cut, and also slashed the university budgets. In Kansas City, it appears the local city budget is growing because of increased sales and utility tax revenues. Do you want one more fact?
Yes. Bring me all the facts. That was great. Good to
All right.
hear we're staying stable in Kansas City, Missouri, so.
Someone else asked, do other industrial nations give a tax deduction for donations to religious organizations? Interesting question. Actually, that whole question, I'm going to flip it on its head. Pew Research did a study, and rather than giving donations to charities, for churches in Europe, in most countries, you're taxed, and your tax dollars go to your church. So in Italy, taxpayers pay 0.8%, and they can choose which church that goes to. In Spanish law, taxpayers can allocate a percentage of their income only to the Catholic Church. And in Denmark, let's see, they pay, Denmark reports that nearly 80% of the people are church members, and they have a tax that comes out of their pay. Sweden and Finland collect taxes from church members of 1 to 2% of income. And Germany, if you're christened or baptized into a church, you are taxed by the government until you formally file a paper to say, I am no longer affiliated with this church. Take me off the tax rolls.
Wow. That is fascinating.
Wow.
Huh.
All right, we do have a question. There's been a lot of questions on rural versus urban nonprofits. So how do we address equal access to funding and technical training for rural communities and nonprofits to thrive?
Who wants to take that one?
It's a huge issue, and just to say, this gets back to the government versus nonprofit funding sort of question. You know, government You have to serve people maybe on a per capita basis or whatever. And we're blessed here in Kansas City. We have a robust philanthropic community. And when you look at the data, depending on how you slice it, Kansas City is in the top 5 in the country for its philanthropic resources and per capita measure and the like. Does that mean that we should fundamentally have better services than somebody in Sedalia? Because if Missouri government's being cut, is that fair? And not to get into kind of angst in America about rural versus urban, but there's, I think, generally a feeling that rural America is being left behind. And philanthropic resources most definitely do not go towards rural communities at the same amount as they go towards urban communities.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of on that same point, it's important to understand that it goes back to the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the fact that nonprofit organizations rely on government funding. I mean, simply put, not all of them do, but as a group, they rely incredibly on government funding. And that's especially true in rural communities. The most robust rural nonprofits are community action agencies, and they rely almost entirely on government for their funding. And just quickly back on the point of government shrinking, I think the one way to think about it is the government workforce shrinking. The other way to think about it is the government's contracting with private entities shrinking. I think it's probably safe to say it's not shrinking as it relates to the military spending, but it is shrinking as it relates to health and human service spending, especially in places in states that haven't expanded Medicaid, especially as it relates to the care of some of the most vulnerable in our communities, children who've been abused and neglected and are in the foster care system. We hear about dysfunction in the care of children in the system, and you can almost always trace back that dysfunction and the horror stories, frankly, that kind of come out of that to inadequate staffing levels of those programs, whether they're government social workers employed at a state agency or at one of the nonprofit organizations to which a state might be outsourcing that service. And the collaboration between the private sector, nonprofit sector, and the public sector is critical, but it's important not to overlook the fact that reducing government investments in the nonprofit sector is having a crippling effect on a lot of the good work that gets done day in and day out. And honestly, that's, again, mostly work done by private sector organizations and not just nonprofits. A lot of churches are doing that work and have contracts with the federal or state or local governmental entities to deliver those services. And philanthropy is never going to be at a level, no matter how much work we do to increase giving, to sort of make up for the loss of resources by out of whack priorities in terms of how we spend our tax dollar.
Anyone have a follow-up to that before I move on to my next question, which is a doozy? So,
Is that a threat?
Yeah.
no, not a threat.
Well, just to put it into context, government and the fact checkers, I will look at you to make sure I have this correct, but government spending, including military and whatnot, is upwards of 20% of our GDP. Spending from philanthropy or philanthropic giving in any given year is about 0.5% of our GDP, meaning that, for example, the 1,000 Points of Light, President Bush, elder, championed this in the early 1990s. Really the idea that we're a philanthropic nation and we're going to step up for each other, and I believe that wholeheartedly. At the same time, when you look at the raw, hard numbers of if government is pulling back out of health and human services, are we really that charitable and philanthropic to make up that difference? And I think we have to look at ourselves in the mirrors. We are all well-intentioned people. I honestly believe that. But from a dollars and cents standpoint, the numbers don't work.
I was going to add one thing to that. It's a little bit off on the fundraising side, but I think there's an obligation and a duty from everybody that as you get into this problem more is to hold our public officials more accountable for what their part is in a lot of this. And you look at public safety, one of the basic functions of government. And in Jackson County alone, we are 2 years away, 2.5 years away, optimistically, from getting a new jail for something that has been identified as a problem for the past 10 years. And we've allowed our elected officials to completely blow this project off and not deal with it. And so you go to some of the most basic things where we have to do things to change the cultural part of the community. There's also a law enforcement standpoint, an incarceration standpoint that in what I found in this, as I've gotten into this, the police will tell you there's 60 to 70 names that continually come up as a source of violent crime in Kansas City. There was an article in the Star last week, and you can fact check exactly because I'm going to go by memory here, but a person that had been convicted of second-degree murder after 15 years was released, and within, I believe, 4 months of being out, was then implicated in another murder, but was finally picked up because he ran from a police car, and they found ammunition on him that matched the caliber of the shootings he was involved in. Why is this guy out after 2 murders, and we're wondering how we have a violent crime problem? So when you look at resources that the government should be directing to certain things, and I am no way, shape, or form saying just lock people up and that solves the problem, but when you have hardcore criminals and we haven't held them accountable for doing their basic functions, it then falls on the philanthropic community to support so many other things that are a byproduct of this.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that even if you're not donating money or resources, it is having your collective voices heard, saying we need action on these items that will help improve the quality of life and reduce violence.
It's almost as if I planted that thought in you, because now that leads to my next questions.
Did
That's
I pre-doozy
perfect.
you? Is that what?
Yeah, you pre-doozied. We just created a term together. That's a private-public partnership that we just had. We just created a new American Public Square term. We know the root causes of violence. In this room, we could sit here, we could make like a big sticky wall where we put our Post-it notes up and we say, okay, prenatal care, spacing between pregnancies, low birth weight. We go along your life cycle, your life cycle approach to this. And we say, when that person got out of prison and they went back to the streets to doing what was comfortable for them, what happened to them? What happened to you? What happened to your communities? However, from my perspective, we seem to have these structures in place where we fund direct service, a lot of direct services to people. And it's late in the game to reverse all of the trauma that's happened. How can we change our funding approaches, our nonprofit approaches, to really hit root causes if we don't let people advocate politically? And if we don't keep an eye on, because there's a follow-up to this. If you need more to go off of, why do we allow people the freedom to contribute to not-for-profit agencies that might be doing more harm than good to the communities? That's kind of like, you could throw that in there if you want to. The root cause question is, how do I fund the root causes of violence if I can't even lobby a little bit?
I think your donors have to take that responsibility
On themselves?
And I think it has to be information and it has to get out there, and it goes back to this whole collective spirit, which maybe is the beginning of collaboration that may not exist, that we can all agree on these certain things, and I think that's where it can happen outside of the strict constructs of what a not-for-profit can do.
Mm-hmm.
So, to flesh out what you were saying, nonprofits, and you may know, but are not allowed to electioneer, it's called. So that means they are allowed to advocate. And there's a fear that that can be construed both in the public sentiment of, hey, my nonprofit's out there, using my funds to lobby. But electioneering is trying to get somebody elected, and that is not allowed under IRS tax code. So I think that's what you're trying to say. But I do think there's ample room for nonprofits to be strong advocates in the public process. And I think donors and their stakeholders need to be saying, hey, I want you out there. You know, I want, as Moxa, I want to see you in Jeff City on the State House steps, and I want you knocking on our reps' doors. That's cool, and I'm giving you a donation so you can go do that, because that's how you multiply influence. But that's really hard. It's ingrained in the nonprofit sector's minds that we will get shut down by the IRS if we do that.
Right.
And there are very distinct guidelines of what can and can't happen, but then just this fear. is
Kind of
actually-
chilling effect on what we can and we cannot say. Yeah, because there's so much at stake. I
Yeah,
get
Sarah,
that.
I think one of the areas, and I'm no expert, so I'll make a quick point and then leave it to others, but I think one of the biggest areas where the voice of the nonprofit leaders and the people that they represent is drowned out just goes back to kind of how we fund elections in our country and our communities, and the way that the messaging is funded, and the extent to which to win at the ballot box, it takes a lot of money.
Yep.
I don't know what the solution is, but I think a lot of the frustration that the most articulate and persuasive advocates feel goes back to their inability to get their message out.
So I'll speak to this as a health communication person. One of the things that we keep realizing is maybe everybody in this room understands what the root causes of violence are. What's interesting is that oftentimes the people who are in positions of power, the people who are creating our policies, surprisingly may not understand what the root causes of violence are.
That's crazy.
And so what we have had to do is education, like a basic violence prevention 101. How do we address this issue before it happens, so upstream, so that we can have policies, we can invest our funds in prevention. Frankly, this is an area that people are not willing to invest in. In the health sector, in public health sector, we continually see our funding being cut in regards to violence prevention, in regards to any kind of prevention, because it just seems people don't understand, how do we prevent violence? What does that look like? I understand response. I understand individual and relational counseling and those kinds of things, but I don't understand it from a policy perspective. I don't understand it from a societal perspective. I don't understand it from a money management perspective in terms of when we're creating our budgets for our health agendas or whatever agendas. So we're having to do some basic education that frankly surprised me, and I shouldn't have been surprised, right?
Yes.
So there's that component too, I think, to us all agreeing this is what the root cause is, we're all on the same page, and let's invest in it. Let's invest the monies, the capacity, and all of those things, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because when you think about an issue like violence prevention, when you think about hot issues like gun control,
Yeah.
right? And if you're talking to a legislator who might have a stack of research on their table from an opposing perspective of yours, right? They got there first, and they were able to get there because maybe it felt more fluid and they're more nimble because they're used to lobbying. They're used to that level of advocacy and influence. And that people are kind of one step ahead on that. So it's really interesting. Do we have another audience question that you would like to do before I give them their final tweeting moments? They have this tweet they're gonna tweet. You have to say it in 140 characters or something. Sorry, sound guy.
Who's
I keep hitting
counting?
the microphone. Yes, we're ready for another audience question, I think.
Well, this question is really about nonprofits and client relationships. So how can we actively get people and communities involved that we fight for? Should they have a word in the work done?
Well, I think I'm going to answer that second part of that question for everybody, yes. But what does that look like? So we've kind of touched a little bit on what does community engagement mean, And how can we avoid this like savior complex, right? Of like, we are swooping in to save you, impoverished people of either East Africa or east of Prospect or whatever east we're talking about. It's like Kevin Costner. It's like a Kevin Costner movie. Yes? Like, there are people in this audience I know who know what I'm talking about. Like, every Kevin Costner movie is him saving a black or brown person or a community. So, like, how do we avoid that? How do you do meaningful engagement, whether you're nonprofit, whether you're for-profit? What does that look like? What a great question, whoever asked that. I'm so excited about this question. Okay, so I'm going to make all of you answer this because I think this is that important. What does it really look like to be at the table for the communities that we're serving?
Look, I'm getting into this, and it's a learning lesson. I was warned by the mayor up front to say no good deed goes unpunished. And as I mentioned last week, we learned from this, and I think there just has to be a sincere effort made that we're here for the long term. As I mentioned, we don't know the answers, but we'll listen and we'll bring what we can to the table, and hopefully this goes across the metro, that this is our problem. It's not the mayor's problem. It's not the chief of police's problem. It's not the governor's problem. It's not the legislator's problem. It's our problem. And, many people have asked, why Kansas City? Why, Nashville, Omaha, Dallas even, why Kansas City? I don't know if we have an answer to that, but the bottom line is it's happening. And as a community, we have a chance to rally everyone together to say it's not going to happen here. And I will tell you one thing that I remember distinctly, and it may have been a dozen or 15 years ago, when there was a serial rapist in Waldo. And the community made it very clear that wasn't going to happen there. Everybody kept their lights on, everybody was watching out for their neighbor, and it stopped, and the culprit was caught. And there was a few incidents that happened along the way, but there was a collective positive sign for that neighborhood. We won't tolerate that here. And I think at some point we have to figure out how to get that in a community thing, that this isn't acceptable. 150 murders a year, the violence, the domestic abuse, everything that happens is not acceptable. And when we collectively say that, and we're here to work out a problem and to work hand in hand with you, I think that's a start, but it's a long haul, and it's going to take, there's been so many starts and stops on it that you can't really say that it's one thing. It's just a commitment to it.
So on the kind of community engagement tip for the rest of you, thinking about building off of that idea of social fabrics of communities, like building social fabrics of communities so that they can be engaged. And I want to highly recommend, if you ever receive the Resident Insights survey in the mail, I don't know if anyone gets as excited about that as I do the KCMO. It's a randomized survey, and we've started asking questions. We asked a year ago. The government is asking questions about your trust of your neighborhoods and whether you have people over to your home, like these ideas of social connections, because we see a correlation between perceptions of safety in a neighborhood and how well you know your neighbors. And I think that Waldo example is indicative of that. So who else wants to tackle solving community engagement and what that means and what it means to have people be a part of the work?
For United Way, we're 100-year-old organization. We're very much in the
brand name
mainstream establishment. Yes. And so authentic community engagement, at least in modern times, has not come easy to us. And I think we have, kind of made some of the most important progress in understanding how to do that effectively. A few years ago, when we were in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce around the launch of the Urban Neighborhood Initiative, where we spent the better part of a year and a half doing not much more than engaging in conversation with neighborhoods, in a very methodical way that involved a tremendous number of voices, and it ultimately, sort of helped to inform the shape of the Urban Neighborhood Initiative and the work that it does today. But I guess the other place that I turn when I think about the term effective in community engagement is to government. You know, I've had the benefit of being involved in a number of committees at City Hall, and you know, you guys do it pretty well. You set an example for the
Wow,
nonprofit sector.
I have never heard that before.
You know, I mean,
I
I
might
serve
cry.
serve as a volunteer on the as a member of the Public Improvements Advisory Committee. Which,
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I actually love it. It's
That's amazing.
boring
I
at
was
times,
not being
but-
facetious. Like,
Okay.
that's the coolest job, and
Well,
everybody
and we
should
get to
do it.
advise the city council on how they
Yeah.
spend tens of millions of
Yeah.
dollars a year collected through the 1 cent sales tax for capital improvements. And there is a pot of dollars carved out for each council district that is invested in neighborhood level projects, about $4 million a year. And virtually all of those dollars get spent through ideas that are generated from the public. Neighborhood associations, individuals, groups of folks who get together who don't have a nonprofit organization behind them. And it's one of the best examples of effective government in action. And then the other, in the public sector, folks who are good at it, I think, to a large extent, is the federal government. I mean, they just simply require it. You know, you're gonna get a big giant federal grant, you have to engage the community in meaningful, well, they're striving for meaningful ways.
Right.
It doesn't always play out that way. But United Way has been in partnership with the Housing Authority of Kansas City for several years on their Choice Neighborhoods initiative. And you'll find some of the best examples of community engagement in the work that they do in developing, in supporting the development of resident leaders and then just residents of public housing who achieve incredible things when their voice is invited to the table.
So I'm hearing also some nods to things like leadership institutes. There's some like very good ones out there, models that kind of build grassroots advocates who might just be people like in this room volunteering their time and coming to an event like this and build them into maybe leaders of these organizations to do the innovative work. So like a pipeline. I love it. What else? I got so excited I broke my pen.
So, and I'll just say two very quick things. One is to embrace complexity, all right? We always like singular answers, right? That, well, this is happening and we need to do that. You know, violence prevention is, there's a lot of confounding factors. So we all have to be okay with that. We open up the Star or CNN or wherever, and you see singular answers, you need to start saying, wait a minute, somebody's pushing something. So it's complex and you have to be okay with that. And the second, and I fall into this too, stop being a philanthropic tourist, right? Stop like going to the bean dinner at the whatever Baptist church where you pat yourself on the back because you gave $50.
Wait, are you running for mayor?
No.
Yeah.
I don't even know what
You
you're
too?
talking about. But no, but you know, be authentically engaged, right? So, gosh, you know,
Yeah.
I get so tired of myself where I feel all good about how I just wrote this check, and that's great.
Yeah.
But seriously, I mean, we're a small enough city
Right.
that you can literally drive a mile in any direction and meet somebody whom you may never have known ever before. How cool is that, right?
I love that. Last word on this goes to you.
And I think in order to do what he's saying that we should do, we need to abandon two things: a paternalistic attitude towards the work that we're doing and our egos. And that's something as an academic that I struggle with. I will be honest with you. And part of what has really helped me and my colleagues in the work that we do is that we have a really deliberate framework for how we engage with community. And we use what we call a community-based participatory or action framework for our engagement. And what that means is that we engage our community through every stage of whatever issue is that we're addressing, from conceptualization to execution to dissemination. And you guys, it's not easy. It takes time, it takes dedication, there's trust building involved. Your bosses may not be cool with how long it's taking. It takes money. But if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. And if you're really committed to this work, then you know, so be it. Abandon the ego, abandon your paternalistic attitude, put that aside, and focus on the issue in the community.
You know what time it is? It's time I break out my stopwatch, because we're going to do a little kind of cap off, and it's going to give everybody an opportunity on the panel to kind of say their so what, right? So we say it's like a tweet length statement, but for those of you who do not tweet or don't tweet often, I'm just going to time you. So we're going to say you have 30 seconds. So you have 30 seconds to make a statement about like what is kind of your Miss America, like your final statement around this question which we've been struggling with. It's like we have this fractured system in a good way and a bad way, and we're struggling to collaborate, we're struggling to engage. What advice do you have? What's your final statement around what we can do as a system to address social problems? And we'll just say like whoever volunteers to go first gets an extra 5 seconds. So who would like to go first on this? And they were prepared a little bit ahead of time to be able to prepare a statement, I want to say. I just I don't want to make it look like I'm putting them on the spot. Okay, who's going first?
First, now I can't
Everyone's looking
read
at Jim.
Now that's a lot of pressure. I can't read the thing I had written down because it's really kind of mundane.
Okay, you just get
But
to say what you want to say.
I guess I'll
Go.
speak from personal experience in the course of my work at United Way, that I feel that I've made the most difference when I've been intentional about talking to more people on more occasions that I would not have a reason to have a conversation with. Whether it's I'm at a meeting and I talk to the person sitting next to me, or we make specific plans to go to an organization that we don't give funding to learn more about what they do. I never say no to a request for a meeting, and that is a mantra that has served me well.
You heard him say that. We all have it documented. Everyone's emailing you right now. So because, and everyone gets to go, but we're also gonna like tie in also your kind of now what's call to action in your 30 seconds. And then, it's a small room, so I'm sure people will stick around after that. So who's next? Who wants their 30 seconds? Okay, go.
I think the environment has created a situation where not-for-profits work in silos. And that's something that we have to completely eliminate if we truly want to make a difference. I think it's that simple.
That was 17 seconds.
That's
You
a good
must be
tweet.
on Twitter. I'm
Yeah.
gonna tweet that one. Okay. Brent, it's your turn.
So I don't even know how Twitter works. I actually opened up my Twitter account and put hashtags in the wrong spot. I didn't even understand. So, embrace complexity, and also sit in somebody else's living room. All right. So seriously, go find somebody whom you never interact with, and go break bread with them, and just be there.
We're all going to Brent's house for dinner.
Yes,
It's
everybody's
exciting.
welcome.
Ask them first if you can enter their living room.
Yeah.
And eat their bread. Okay.
That's what I was going to say. That's okay. though.
Okay. Your turn.
He said what I was going to say. Can I just say that?
Yes. You get to say ditto. That's collaboration.
Okay, so I have two things. Collaboration isn't a dirty word. It's necessary, I think, for the kind of work that we do. And number two, to what he says, put yourself in uncomfortable situations. Put yourself in with people that you normally wouldn't be around, that that sort of give you that feeling, and learn about them, and learn that you're not so different, and that you have things in common, and that you can work together. I think that's how we create the empathy that we're looking for, the sympathy that we're looking for. From a health communication standpoint, that's how we sell whatever it is,
Yep. Empathy at the root of it.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of humility,
Yeah.
and avoiding this idea that we're there to save people, right? And that it does affect all of us, whether we live, I do everything by zip codes, 64132 or 64106. It affects all of us. Jim, Bill, Brent, Natty, this has been such a fun way to spend our evening, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I obviously enjoyed being up here with them. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists.